Double Dragon 3: The Rosetta Stone, released in arcades in 1990, and was a bit of a departure from the previous Double Dragon games. For starters, it was not developed in-house by Technos, but rather by a smaller developer called East Technology. It was also notable in that it incorporated a fourth-wall breaking item shop, in which players could insert additional quarters to purchase health upgrades, weapons, special moves, and additional characters, which was honestly pretty forward-thinking, if nothing else. Double Dragon 3 received a number of home ports for various computers, the Sega Genesis, and the Game Boy. There was also a standalone adaptation for the NES, which was a unique version rather than a direct port of the arcade game, and it was also the only version developed by Technos themselves. The one thing all the versions of Double Dragon 3 seem to have in common, though, is that they all seem to be the least liked of their respective trilogies. The arcade game has extremely choppy animation. Characters don't smoothly move all over the screen so much as warp from one location to another, similar to a Game & Watch game. Now, I originally assumed that this was an emulation issue when I first saw this, but this appears to be how the game actually runs. And the shop mechanic that required players to pay extra quarters to have a moderately easier time with the game may have seemed like a pretty good idea on paper, but from what I've read, it didn't go over nearly as well as they might have hoped. This microtransaction system was received so poorly that it was entirely cut out of the Japanese release. The Genesis version addressed this item shop by giving you a set number of credits that you could spend as you wish throughout the game, and the choppy character movement was smoothed over. But generally, it seems that this version of Double Dragon 3 is seen as a moderately improved port of a game that wasn't particularly good in the first place. And the NES version is rather infamous for its appearance on the Angry Video Game Nerd. And while the general opinion of this game appears to have warmed a little bit in recent years, I think it's safe to say that most people are content to echo whatever he said about the game in that episode. But the only game I can personally speak for is the Game Boy version, which is the only version of Double Dragon 3 I've actually played. Now, the quickest way to find out exactly how many fans a particular game has is to say something remotely critical about it. So before we go any further, let me just clarify that if you really like this game, I'm not trying to take that away from you. There's no intention to Double Dragon 3 shame anyone. But Double Dragon 3, when held up not only against the first two Double Dragon games on the Game Boy, but also against the 100-some-odd other Game Boy games I've played through, is kind of awful. Visually, this is a noticeable downgrade from the first two Double Dragon games. The graphics have that muddy, cluttered look that I've come to associate with games that try a little too hard to reproduce 16-bit graphics. I don't know, maybe that's not the issue at all, but the art style from the first two games was cleaner and appeared more detailed, and the character animations were better in those games too. I don't want to harp on the graphics too much, but visually this game just looks extremely amateurish, which I guess could be just chalked up to the fact that the developer, Sales Curve Interactive, was less experienced than Technos. Then you have the shop. Whereas the Genesis version of the game starts you with, I think, 15 credits to spend on upgrades, in this version you just start with 2. You earn an extra coin each time you complete a section for a total of just 7 or 8 coins that you can earn during the entire course of the game. The shop only appears in the first 3 of the game's 5 stages, and what you can actually buy varies slightly from shop to shop. The available options in the first shop are Life, which is an extra life, Power Up, which is a complete health refill, and Weapon, which is either nunchucks or a katana, depending on the stage. Trick is available for purchase from the second and third shops, which is a hurricane kick. Weapons and special moves purchased from the shop will last until you either lose a life or end the stage. With special attacks and weapons relegated to shop purchases, the default combat options are extremely basic. You start the game with a punch, a kick, holding down A and B together will do a jump kick, and if the layout of the stage allows for it, you can do an off-the-wall jump kick. There's no cool special moves like uppercuts, shoulder throws, or pile drivers. Oh wait, my mistake, that's actually a knee drop. Sorry, I'm not totally up on my wrestling terminology. Collision detection is extremely spotty. It's difficult to make punches and kicks land. For you at least, because enemies don't really seem to have a problem with it. They also like to pile up on top of you so that your character sprite gets completely buried under a nonsensical mosaic of pixels, making it impossible to know who is actually doing damage to who. At least until you get knocked down. Because here's the thing, it's almost always you who is taking hits. Of course, that's until you realize what the trick to this game is. The game's damage system seems to operate on joust rules. in that whoever has the higher ground will win the coin toss when two characters are attacking at once. I've never been able to successfully land an attack if I'm on a lower plane than the enemy characters, but if I'm standing just above them, it's honestly hard to lose.
Now, I would understand why you would see this as an unfair cheat against the game, but almost every enemy in the game has a longer hitbox than you do and also can outmaneuver you. So in this case, I'd say that cheat strats just kind of level the playing field.
Double Dragon 3 is an extremely short game. Each stage is just a few screens long, populated by just a handful of enemies and a boss. Adding to the brevity of the stages is the fact you move very quickly. When you lose a life, you respawn on the spot like Contra. So for better or worse, the game keeps a pretty brisk, steady momentum all the way through to the end. For as much as I enjoyed the first two Double Dragon games on the Game Boy, Double Dragon 3 was a pretty big disappointment. I haven't played too many games that I would consider legitimately bad games. Believe it or not, I can find at least one redeeming quality in most games that I've played. But I'm really struggling to think of anything positive to say about this one. The graphics and music are unimpressive, scratch that, they're actually bad. The movement is weird, and the combat is cheap and often unfair. Once again, I suppose the short length of the game is the only thing I'd say is remotely positive. It may be a clumsy, unfun mess, but at least it doesn't take up a lot of your time. It seems like on the NES, in any series that made it to at least 3 games, the third game is often considered to be the pinnacle of the series, or at the very least, has a loyal fan base that would consider it their favorite in said series. Ninja Gaiden 3, Mega Man 3, Castlevania 3, Super Mario 3, Adventures of Lolo 3, and what do people think of Dragon Warrior 3? Does that count? I think Double Dragon is the only game series that is thought to have completely shit the bed with the third entry, but I have a feeling that even that would be hotly debated. Now, I believe Adventure Island 2 is the fan favorite of the NES trilogy, but my personal favorite is Adventure Island 3. Honestly, Adventure Island 2 and 3 are essentially the same game, but I prefer the third one because of its less obtuse overworld map. What I didn't like about Adventure Island 2 is that each of the game's 8 islands consisted of an unspecified number of stages that were also unmarked on the overworld map, and progression from stage to stage was determined by which egg you picked from the roulette wheel at the end of each level. Unless you were really paying attention, your progress through each island and the number of stages you'd have to play through would appear completely arbitrary, and it was unreasonably difficult to establish an optimal path unless you were using a guide. Adventure Island 3 simplified this a bit by sticking to a linear stage progression through each island, but there would always be one stage in each island that would contain a secret exit that would set you on a separate path through a series of additional stages. This added to its replayability by ensuring that you'd never be able to see the entire game on a single playthrough, but more importantly, it also put you more in control of which stages you played without needing to constantly count eggs. Adventure Island 3 also introduced the Boomerang, which could destroy enemies and objects that the Hatchet couldn't, as well as the Jewel power-up, which allowed you to enter a stage with a shield that would let you take a hit without losing a life. It also added a new dinosaur to the roster of companions, a Triceratops that could destroy enemies and boulders with a Sonic the Hedgehog-esque spin attack.
Now, I'm still not exactly sure why they renamed Adventure Island 2 when they adapted it to the Game Boy, but I have a feeling they thought it would be weird to essentially start a new series on a new platform with a game that was numbered 2. So to avoid confusion, they simply called it Adventure Island. However, in their efforts to avoid confusion, they simply created more confusion. And then they doubled down on that when they ported Adventure Island 3 to the Game Boy, because they of course called it Adventure Island 2.
The Game Boy adaptation of Adventure Island 3 is basically the same as the NES version, but just like the Game Boy version of Adventure Island 2, there are a few quality of life improvements to the game that make it an easier and more enjoyable experience. No doubt taking a cue from Super Mario World, the overworld is shown as a continuous map with a clearly marked path leading from one stage to the next. Just as in the NES version, there's one stage in each area that has a secret exit leading to an alternate path, but this time this stage is easily identified by the separate path leading away from it, which cuts down on the guesswork needed to access the extra levels. However, once you beat the area boss, every stage in that area, including the secret ones, become available, which leads me to the biggest change this game makes over its NES counterpart. You can return to a stage even after you've beaten it. This makes building up your collection of dinosaurs and power-ups much easier, as you can replay loot-heavy stages as often as you'd like to farm for items. In the previous game, they altered Master Higgins' sprite to make him fit onto the Game Boy screen a little better, but this time it seems they recreated his NES sprite pixel for pixel, so he takes up a bit more room on the screen. Normally I'd have a gripe or two about this, but the larger character sprite doesn't ever really become an issue, because they noticeably scaled back the game's difficulty. Master Higgins moves more slowly, even when he's running, so there's much more time to react to enemies when they scroll onto the screen. The enemies themselves behave less aggressively, and they've also been placed with consideration for how you'll be moving through the stages. In some levels, the screen will need to scroll vertically as you move into areas above or below you, and while this will occasionally result in a hit from a surprise enemy, for the most part the enemies have all been placed in such a way that the number of cheap hits is practically at zero. The long and short of it is that Adventure Island 2 is a really great adaptation of Adventure Island 3 from the NES. It doesn't necessarily provide a dramatically new experience for those who are already familiar with the original game, but it does deliver a meaty, satisfying game that in some ways is more accessible and more enjoyable than its NES counterpart. Castlevania 2 Belmont's Revenge appeared on the Game Boy in the summer of 1991, and it was received very well. After that though, the series pretty much went into hibernation, on the Game Boy at least. If we zoom out though, the Castlevania series on a whole continued to thrive on the home consoles, with Super Castlevania 4 on the Super Nintendo in 1991, the Japan-only Rondo of Blood for the PC Engine in 1993, Bloodlines for the Sega Genesis in 1994, and in 1995 we got an altered port of Rondo of Blood for the Super Nintendo called Dracula X. And finally, at the end of 1997, the Castlevania series moved to the Sony PlayStation with Symphony of the Night. Castlevania Legends released in the US in early 1998, which was possibly the worst possible time for the game to come out. We were deep into the 5th console generation at this point, and the Game Boy was looking pretty archaic next to the PlayStation, Nintendo 64, and Sega Saturn. Sales numbers for the Game Boy had been in steady decline since 1993, and the number of games being released had slowed to a trickle. There were less than 20 games released between March of 97 and 98, and even though a handful of recent high-profile releases had kept the Game Boy somewhat relevant, we were still a ways off from the massive surge in popularity the Game Boy would see when Pokemon came out later that year. Castlevania Legends wasn't received with much fanfare either. Nintendo Power gave it a very lukewarm 6.4 out of 10, and Electronic Gaming Monthly gave it a below average score of 4.75 out of 10. What's worse, despite being developed as a prequel to the entire Castlevania series, Legends has been decanonized by Konami and, as far as I know, has not been referenced in any of the other games. The first time I played Castlevania Legends was in the summer of 2012, and full disclosure, I was extremely sick with a summer flu at this time, and honestly should not have been attempting to play any game for the first time, because I was not in a position to enjoy anything, let alone a game that had significant flaws that were immediately apparent as soon as the game began, like the way it looks and the way it sounds. This negative association I created between Castlevania Legends and the dark, miserable week of nausea and feverish night sweats was so strong that I had no interest in revisiting the game for the next 13 years, which I can freely admit was not entirely fair to the game. Now, having finally played through this game multiple times, I can still say with some honesty that it's probably not a game I'll ever be compelled to play again. But at the same time, it's not a bad game. So the remainder of this review will probably just be me excusing Castlevania Legends for its many, many flaws, which is honestly not a position I expected to take when I started playing this game for this video. So like I was saying earlier, Castlevania Legends is meant to be a prequel to the entire Castlevania franchise. You play as Sonia Belmont in the first confrontation between the Belmont clan and Dracula. At some point in the game, you'll run into Alucard, and it's heavily implied that he and Sonia are romantically involved, which would make him the father of the unnamed child seen at the end of the game, and by extension, the forefather of all the Belmont characters who have appeared in every other Castlevania game. I imagine it was specifically this detail that caused Castlevania Legends to be Thanos snapped out of the Castlevania timeline. But I actually don't have a problem with this. This honestly makes a whole lot more sense than the utter nonsense they came up with for the Lords of Shadow series. Within the context of being the first Castlevania game, there's some nice logic to how Legends strays from the typical Castlevania formula. Sonya does the typical Castlevania stuff like whipping candles to collect hearts, but there are no sub-weapons in the game, not in the traditional sense at least. You can find the classic Castlevania sub-weapons in secret areas throughout the game, but these are just Easter eggs. You had to find all of them to see the true ending to the game, so in a sense, it could be seen as Sonya symbolically unlocking each of these items so they can continue to appear for future members of the Belmont clan. Another detail I think is kind of neat is that after defeating Medusa later in the game, her head kind of flies off screen, implying that Sonya's actions have created one of the most notorious enemies in the entire Castlevania series. Instead of sub-weapons, Sonya gains what the game calls a soul weapon every time she defeats a stage boss, and these become selectable like the weapons in a Mega Man game. One ability will allow you to freeze enemies for several seconds, and another will completely refill your health bar. There's a weapon that will damage all the enemies on the screen, and another that lets you throw a fireball, which is kind of redundant since that's also what the fully powered up whip lets you do. And the last power you receive will let you destroy all the enemies on the screen. Now, as you can imagine, these abilities, as long as you have the hearts available to use them, make Legends a much easier game than most other entries to the series. Sonya is also much more agile than your typical Castlevania protagonist, in that she can still freely move during a jump like any normal video game character, instead of being locked into a rigid jump arc like in the other games. Sonya also has a special move called Burning Mode, whereby pressing A and B together she'll essentially go Super Saiyan for about 10 seconds, making her invincible and able to move faster. You can only use this once per life per stage, but it pretty much trivializes every boss fight in the game. There are 6 levels in the game, although one of them is a secret area that requires a completely untelegraphed leap of faith to access. There's not really a lot of innovation in the design of these stages or the mechanics within them. Generally, these are all very basic, by-the-numbers Castlevania levels, but they're all quite large and filled with branching paths, and your exploration is rewarded with extra lives, health refills, or those aforementioned sub-weapon tokens. Castlevania Legends is a much better game than I expected, but it still has a number of nagging issues that keep it from being great. The graphics are not very good. Most of the characters look like primitive stick figures drawn in Microsoft Paint. The stages and backgrounds are very basic and uninteresting to look at. There's unfortunately none of the lush details or animations that we saw in Belmont's Revenge. Considering how late this game came out on the hardware and how far Game Boy games had come by this time, it's disappointing that Legends actually looks worse than Castlevania Adventure, which was one of the first games created for the Game Boy. Legends isn't a particularly difficult game, but it is kind of annoying. Sonya's whip strike is about half of what it is in the previous games, which may not be too much of an issue when you're fully powered up and can throw that fireball, but unless you can make it all the way through the game without dying, you can't always count on having that fireball attack. There's also a surprising amount of verticality to the game that you really don't have a good way to deal with. A lot of enemies come at you from above, often at such sharp angles that it's difficult to hit them with your whip before you take a hit. One of the game's favorite tricks is to surprise you with annoyingly placed enemies as you're climbing or platforming up through vertically oriented areas. And it's easy to get trapped in a situation where a bat or a ghost knocks you downward during a tricky jump, only to respawn immediately as you start climbing back up and then knock you back down again. Granted, once you have it, you can use the wind ability to freeze enemies long enough to get into a better position to deal with them, but these were the main instances where I would have liked to have had at least one proper sub-weapon to augment Sonya's attacks. Castlevania Legends is far from a perfect game, but it's still good enough that I think it definitely deserved better treatment from Konami when it first came out. I'm not sure what the general opinion of this game is now, but the impression I've gotten is that it has become a little more appreciated in recent years. Between the two of them, I still prefer Castlevania Adventure, but Legends is definitely the better game. Oh, and it also has Super Game Boy support. If you made it this far, allow me to formally welcome you to the end of the video. If you liked this video and want to see more, there are many more Game Boy focused videos on my channel, just like this one. If you have a favorite Game Boy game or game series, feel free to mention it in the comment section below. And I'll see you next time on The Good, The Bad, and the Game Boy.